Global Affairs Canada saying evacuation efforts ongoing in Israel and the West Bank. A 16th Canadian military flight took off today. More than 1,500 Canadians have been taken to safety, but evacuation flights now dropping down to just one per day. There are still about 430 Canadians that we know of trapped in Gaza, unable to get out until some kind of humanitarian corridor opens up.
An expectation that there will be an opportunity for humanitarian aid to go into Gaza. It only makes sense that that aid goes in and the gate opens and we have the possibility to also bring people out. So this is what we're planning for. When it does, we are ready to be able to receive Canadians and their family members on the Egyptian side and to facilitate their return to Canada.
All right, for a better understanding of the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding right now and the possibility of trying to get anyone out of Gaza, Samantha Nutt is joining us from Toronto. She is the founder of the international humanitarian organizations War Child USA, War Child Canada. And Sean Carroll is in Washington, D.C., president and CEO of the American Near East Refugee Aid, or ANERA. Good to see both of you. Thanks for taking the time for Power Play. Samantha, maybe I can start with you. I know you're just back from the region, including a trip to Jordan. The number one thing that people need to know about what's happening in Gaza right now?
We have to reopen those borders. We have to get aid in, and we have to have safe passage of humanitarian supplies. This is an increasingly dire situation. You have 1 million people who are displaced. You have an electrical infrastructure that is not functioning, hospitals that will very soon run out of fuel for their generators and run out of supplies to be able to take care of the sick and the wounded. And so from my perspective, getting that border open is the number one priority and the path towards at least providing some level of support for civilians who are in great need right now.
Sean, your read.
Yeah, well, Samantha has painted an accurate picture of the depravity and the needs. It's a human catastrophe. I think what's important to recognize is we're talking about 2.3 million people that need assistance, and it may be that only half of them have been forced to leave their homes, but they're all in need of assistance. On an average day, about 500 trucks full of commerce, regular commerce, goes into Gaza, food and other items. And so 20 trucks is just the very first trickle of what's needed.
Sean, can I stay with you and ask you what you're hearing from your people on the ground right now?
Well, our understanding is that the first truck did just go in, so that's very good news. But again, there's such a huge need, and I know that the Egyptian authorities and the United Nations, and appreciate Secretary General Guterres going to the border. I've worked with him. He's a good man. We should all pay attention to what he says, because he's telling it like it is when he talks about what the needs are. But as he pointed out, there's just a need for a lot more. We probably have to have the Rafah border open continuously, and maybe need to have the Kerem Shalom border open as well. There's just a massive need, and it's urgent. People will begin to die or get very sick from dehydration, from a lack of food, and the situation's dire.
Sean, you said the first truck, from what you're hearing, has now crossed into Gaza. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, so we could be seeing the beginning of that humanitarian aid now starting to flow into Gaza. It is just past midnight local time, Saturday in the region. Samantha, to you and your thoughts on that news, as well as if I can also ask you how a humanitarian corridor might work in practice. We talked about a number of Canadians, hundreds of them, who are in Gaza, but many other people from countries around the world are in Gaza as part of those 2 million plus civilians.
Absolutely. And just to echo what Sean said, I mean, the fact that one truck has hopefully gone in, that is a positive step. At the same time, right now, even with President Biden's announcement, we're talking about 20 trucks. This is an area that was reliant, 80% of the population was previously reliant on humanitarian aid. That is even more acute, more serious right now. And so 20 trucks, even 100 trucks, if it gets to that, is probably not going to be sufficient. And so making sure that there is an ongoing, free, easy way to have the free-flowing goods that go back and forth across the border. And so when you talk about humanitarian corridors, the point is that it has to go in both directions, or at least it should be going in both directions, which is to say that the humanitarian supplies are going in, and not only are they going into Gaza, but they're getting to where they need to go. And so that becomes a lot more complicated when you still have this kind of high-level aerial bombardment. Even more complicated if there is a ground war. It becomes that much more difficult to ensure safe passage of those goods, of those those trucks to the places where they're most needed, particularly in the north right now. And so that's a major concern. Getting goods into the southern part of Gaza is one thing, but getting them up to the north where people still remain locked in and in increasingly dire need is another monumental challenge that has yet to be resolved. And they need to have guarantees around the safe passage of those goods. When it comes to people trying to come out, that's going to be, I think, a much more extensive negotiation. It's going to take some time. It's going to take processes and procedures to ensure that those people are cleared before passing. And I think that given the ongoing tensions in the region, that is going to be something that's going to take weeks and weeks to actually have clarity around and a process that is efficient and effective going forward.
Right, because Sean, I can imagine the Israelis are going to want to vet each and every one of those people.
Yeah, and it's and the goods as well. They're conduct security checks to make sure there isn't dual use. What we and other humanitarian organizations do is ensure that the aid goes to those who need it most and is not diverted. And so we provide a level of security. We've been doing it. We've been 55 years as a U.S. organization working in Palestine. We've had an office continuously in Gaza for almost 50 years. And that's part of our daily work, emergency moment or no, is how do we ensure the aid goes to where it needs to go, does not contradict international law, and we're good at that, and the international NGOs that we work with as well. So if we're all focused on the humanitarian needs, humanitarian principles, we're making sure we're getting aid to where it needs to go and not diverting it, then we need the cooperation of everyone. And certainly a continuation of hostilities, of bombings, of a land invasion are not compatible with humanitarian delivery of aid or humanitarian exit of people that need to exit for special health care or what have you. So that's critical as well. It's not compatible. We do need the point that Samantha made about the north. Many people didn't evacuate from the north because they decided it wouldn't be any safer to go south. Some went south and discovered that in fact they didn't feel safer. There were bombings there as well, and went back home. And of course, hospitals, doctors, and nurses have refused to evacuate because they're taking care of patients who can't afford that risk of moving when they're in such dire straits and need of medical attention and medicines.
Samantha, Israel doesn't want anyone from Hamas having anything to do with the humanitarian aid. Can you give us some insights into, in practice, how that aid would be given out to civilians once it reaches Gaza?
Well, I think, as Sean mentioned, it comes down to having trusted local partners and organizations that have had, and their organization is one that's a very good example of this, the Red Cross, the Red Crescent as well, organizations that have established partners, established staff, strong local connections. They're very, very adept at being able to manage these kinds of distributions once the goods get into country. The challenge, though, is going to be in this increasingly complex security environment. How do you get those goods to the people who need it most? I'm less concerned about the humanitarian aid being diverted to armed forces and very concerned about making sure that they get exactly to those in the highest need. And keep in mind within this that whenever you have a catastrophe like this, and I've worked in Somalia during the famine and elsewhere, there are different waves to these kinds of crises. We also saw this in Iraq during the aerial bombardment. You have the immediate number of people who are killed, but then as this drags on over the coming weeks, when you've got the decimation of the electrical infrastructure, when you've got contaminated water, when you've got a lack of food, that's when you start to see the second and the third wave, and that hits children especially very, very hard. And so death tolls that are in the thousands right now from the immediate bombardment, if this drags on without a suitable humanitarian response, and you get contaminated water, and you start to get starvation, then you're looking at a death toll that's in the tens of thousands, and that will certainly affect children the most. So it's not just a case of being able to get humanitarian supplies in. It's also the case that you need that continuous pipeline, and you need the resources, you need the staff on the ground to be able to engage in these kinds of preventative strategies to make sure that this doesn't become a humanitarian catastrophe, unlike, I think, anything we have seen in recent memory, to be honest.
Samantha Nutt joining us from Toronto, Sean Carroll joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for your time joining Power Play today. Much appreciated.